Welcome to Access Asia, I'm Yuka Hoye. Coming up in this edition, from a K-pop drum duet to a feud with China to an extra early election, Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has had quite a roller coaster ride in her first 3 months in office. We'll take a closer look. A force to be reckoned with. India has demonstrated its growing diplomatic clout with back-to-back trade deals with Europe and the United States. We'll get an expert view on the rise and rise of the South Asian nation and its challenges. And Basant is back in Lahore. Hundreds of kites take wing again as Pakistan lifts an 18-year ban on the centuries-old festival, albeit with restrictions. She has cited Margaret Thatcher as a role model, wants to criminalize flag desecration, and danced around Donald Trump aboard a US warship. Sanae Takaichi, the hardline conservative Japanese prime minister, rode through a wave of popularity in her first 3 months in office, pursuing expansionary fiscal policy and calling for a constitutional reform. Most recently, her decision to dissolve parliament and call a snap election nearly 3 years early shook the nation. Catherine Viet takes a closer look at the Iron Lady of Japan.
A keen drummer and a heavy metal fan, Sanae Takaichi got to display that when she drummed along to the hit song from Netflix's K-pop Demon Hunters with the South Korean president. A moment that went viral online and helped propel the Japanese prime minister's popularity into a craze some are calling sanakatsu or sanamania. The pink pen she uses to scribble notes in Parliament and her favorite snacks are in hot demand. Even the $900 handbag she carries is sold out.
I saw a lot of posts going viral about it. So, I think it would be nice if I could use the same thing as her.
Since taking office, Takaichi has promoted a plan to increase spending to jumpstart Japan's sluggish economy and strengthen defenses to counter China's growing military might. Relations between Tokyo and Beijing remain tense after the prime minister said she would come to Taiwan's aid if the island was attacked.
Sanae Takaichi's comment on a potential contingency across the Taiwan Strait and Japan's inevitable sort of involvement in that angered China very much. However, she has gained in stature as a tough woman, as an iron lady of modern Japan.
One of Takaichi's long-term goals is to change the country's constitution so the self-defense forces are formally recognized. Currently, Article 9 stipulates that Japan will not maintain military forces or wage war. The push comes as U.S. President Donald Trump urged Tokyo to spend more on weapons as Washington and Beijing pursue military influence in the region. Takaichi has said she's keen to forge closer ties with the Trump administration.
In order to make Japan and the United States stronger and more prosperous, I want to work together with President Trump to build a new golden age of the Japan-US alliance.
Her message appears to be resonating, with many of her supporters saying they like her strong stance on national security.
India held a win-win situation after reaching a trade deal with the United States, just days after finalizing a free trade agreement with the European Union. The events demonstrated New Delhi's growing clout in the fast-changing geopolitical landscape as it positions itself as a balancing power and a leader of the global South. Well, for more, let's bring in Dr. Chidich Bajpai, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House in London. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Chidich, just weeks ago, the Trump-Modi bromance seems to have turned cold. Then came this trade deal. Are the US-India ties back on track then?
Yeah, I would say that concerns about the state of the India-US relationship in the aftermath of last year's tensions were somewhat exaggerated. There is a longstanding linkage between both countries. There have obviously been frictions as a result of the reciprocal tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on India and the additional tariffs as a result of India's purchase of Russian crude. And I think that has eroded some of what I would call the irrational exuberance that existed in New Delhi towards the India-US relationship, this belief that India and the US maintain some sort of privileged or special relationship. I think that has clearly faded in the aftermath of the recent downturn. But I think the relationship is far more robust than many generally believed.
But New Delhi has been playing a balancing out. How has it been playing out in the current geopolitical environment?
So India maintains this long-standing commitment towards strategic autonomy in its foreign policy, which essentially means engaging all major poles of influence in the international system. And it's interesting to note that within a span of 12 months, India will have hosted all major world leaders. We had President Putin of Russia visiting India in December, the EU leadership visiting India last month in January. President Xi Jinping of China is likely to visit India when it hosts the BRICS summit later this year. And we could potentially even see President Trump visiting India if it hosts the Quad summit, the Quad being this grouping of Asia's 4 major maritime democracies. It was scheduled to take place last year, but postponed amid the downturn in India-US relations. So I think all of this can be seen as a vindication of India's multi-aligned foreign policy, and that's also playing out in the domain of trade and economics.
So while spearheading this multi-aligned foreign policy, India has increasingly been positioning itself as a leading voice of the global South. How has it grown its influence, its sphere of influence under Prime Minister Narendra Modi?
India frankly lacks the economic heft of say China, and its economy is 1/5 the size of that of China's. But India does try to exert its influence in the global South through various means. One example, for instance, is digital public infrastructure, a means of improving digital inclusion or the democratization of technology in the global South. India, I think, tries to offer a more benign worldview, which is non-Western but not explicitly anti-Western, unlike other countries such as China, Russia, or Iran. And then obviously India's credentials as the world's largest democracy, I think also sort of support that narrative.
So it's still far behind China in its economic clout, but by some measure, India is now the 4th largest economy in terms of nominal GDP, overtaking Japan, and is looking to outside Germany by 2030. So can it ever challenge China?
The government has set a target for India to emerge as a developed country, or what it calls Viksit Bharat, by 2047, which is the country's centenary. And in doing so, it also wants to make India into a global manufacturing hub. But this is going to be easier said than done. India will need to have annual growth rates of about 8% in order to reach that target. The Indian economy continues to face several structural challenges. Manufacturing as a share of GDP has actually stalled over the last decade, despite the government offering several fiscal incentives to make India into a more attractive investment destination. And India's contribution to global manufacturing is about 1/10 that of China. So India still has a long way to go, and it needs to make some progress or further progress on what is referred to as factor market reforms. These are fundamental reforms related to labor, land acquisition, infrastructure, but progress has been patchy and uneven. And I think that's fueled to some degree by India's domestic politics and the fact that politically sensitive reforms have sometimes been harder to pass.
Well, Dr. Chirish Bajpai, thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, bright colours have returned to the skies of Pakistan's Punjab province. The Basant Kite Festival has kicked off for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Kite flying is more than just a sport in the country. It represents harmony, joy and freedom and has brought communities together for centuries. But a series of deadly accidents led to a total ban, and although that has now been lifted, authorities have imposed tight regulations on the activity. France 24's Camille Knight is here for more. Hi, Camille.
Hi, Yuka.
So it might surprise people to hear that kite flying was so controversial there. Why was the festival banned in the first place?
Well, this is a very exciting year for Pakistanis living in the Punjab province. Let's show you just some pictures first from social media of the first kites being flown, celebrating the arrival of spring. It's those very kites that got the festival banned back in 2007, and this was a particularly serious ban. You could risk being put in prison for up to 5 years just for flying a kite, and sellers would risk up to 7 years since they were considered traffickers. Police even used drones to track them down, and the reason why is that some of the strings used could be strong enough to cut people's throats, even many made from metal, others glass-coated, which made them particularly dangerous. Now, that's because kite flying can be a very competitive sport where you actively try and cut down your rival's kite. Now, to give you just a sense of the impact, in 2005, about 13 people died and more than 500 people were injured, a lot of them children. People also fell off rooftops where the kites are flown, and the metal strings would sometimes touch the power lines, which could lead to electrocution. Authorities even involved religious leaders that issued a fatwa declaring kite flying un-Islamic. Many disagreed with the ban, though, with associations dedicated to bringing the festival back.
So that's what authorities have decided to do this year, to allow it to take place, but with regulation.
That's right. So they are letting this festival go ahead. They've put in place particularly strict rules. Only cotton strings are allowed, no metallic threads, and no oversized kites. Dilapidated rooftops have also been barred, fireworks too, and there can't be any kite flying in restricted areas like airports, for example. And you can't also just sell homemade kites either. Manufacturers have been asked to register through deputy commissioners to ensure compliance. Trade is booming, though, for those registered sellers. On the first day on authorised trading, about 400,000 kites were sold, just showing the scale of public enthusiasm for the festival in Lahore. That's great news for traditional kite makers who'd been out of business for so long. And of course, this year is all about reclaiming cultural memory and reviving tradition despite those restrictions that have been put in place.
So clearly there's a lot of excitement. What can we expect this year, and why is this kite festival so culturally important in Pakistan?
Very exciting. Like you say, people who are under 18 would have never experienced this festival, this spring festival on this scale. The tradition goes back over 2 centuries. But the proper celebration started off as a Hindu tradition, though it's now celebrated by all faiths. The kite flying itself only came into play in the Mughal era, so 16th century onwards. That's because flying kites was initially a courtly sport where emperors, nobles and princes would compete on palace rooftops that then trickled down to the city, and when the emperors fell, it stayed with the people. It survived the colonial era, though it was a bit more muted at the time, and after partition with India, it lost its religious framing and Lahore became the centre of it all. So it's a festival that survived empire, colonisation, nation building and regulation, so you can imagine why the people of Lahore are so excited to have it back.
Yeah, and I'm also excited. I want to see more of them. Well, Camille, thank you so much for that. And that's it for this week's Access Asia, but do stay tuned if you can. There's more world news coming up.